Hi, and welcome to the Speaking Your Brand podcast. I'm your host, Carol Cox. We are diving into in-person speaking, which I am so excited about because we've been doing more and more in-person speaking here at Speaking Your Brand. I know that many of you are as well. So we're going to take the next few episodes to talk about strategies you can use to up-level your in-person speaking. Today, we're going to talk about audience engagement. So not only direct audience engagement, asking the audience questions, getting them to participate, but also how do you keep the audience's attention for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, or longer when you can't ask show of hands questions every minute along the way? That's what we're going to dive in today. My guest is Katie Anderson, who was on this podcast back in June of 2022, where she talked about how she's incorporating more storytelling into the keynotes and the presentations that she does, which ding, ding, ding is a key component of keeping your audience engaged. So we'll talk about that as well. Katie is a phenomenon. She is a internationally recognized leadership and learning coach, consultant, and professional speaker. She has an award-winning book that she published in 2020. And Katie will talk to us about that. It's called Learning to Lead, Leading to Learn. And she has been all around the world this year speaking, which is why I wanted her to come back on the podcast to talk about some of the lessons and the strategies that she has learned. Katie, welcome back.
Thanks, Carol. I am thrilled to be back here and to talk about how we engage our audiences.
Yes, and you are now such a pro at this because I know you do a variety of different types of speaking engagements, everything from workshops for executives at companies, whether that's in person and virtual. You also go on stages where there's 500 people or 1,500 people and more. You've had some really interesting stage experiences this year, which I want to dive into. But let's kind of set the stage, so to speak, for the listeners. And thinking about these speaking engagements, especially the ones you've done for the past year or so, what sticks out to you as far as the main things that you have found keeps your audiences engaged and with you and wanting to keep listening as you're going along?
Absolutely. Thanks, Carol. And yeah, I'd say number one is the storytelling, right? And so this is something that I've really been working on with you in particular, first coming to your retreat in the winter, spring of 2022 last year, and really seeing that I wanted to up level. I'm a really good expert facilitator, and I'm starting to speak on bigger stages about my book and really wanted to be bringing in that storytelling aspect. So I wasn't doing this so much the teaching from the stage. And I have gotten tremendous feedback that the stories I've been bringing in and more of almost the acting, you helped me, there's a part where I have a lion and I really acted out, which didn't feel comfortable to me in the beginning, but I've had people coming up to me after my talks being like, I'm the lion too. And so those hooks that are really that emotional hook, the storytelling and much more of, I guess, that using that physical presence on the stage has been really powerful. And then of course, as you always talk about, having a framework to anchor your messages on so that it's easy for people to remember. And those are your teaching point. And then you can always do, things following it. But those are the two things that I've found really been the most helpful for audiences.
Yeah, and I love the storytelling part and the performance aspects of it, and especially when you are in front of an audience and people also in this day and age with our social media feeds, I feel like we're so used to having content go so fast and having short content and different voices and different things that we're looking at, that if you have one speaker on the stage for 30 or 45 minutes, even if there's a little bit of vocal variation, audiences kind of tune out. Like our attention spans have shifted. And I feel like the storytelling and the performance, even just that movement, keeps our eyes kind of moving around and keeps our brains more activated.
Absolutely. And I've really observed in the last 18 months, so sort of that, beginning of 2022 when conferences were opening up again and then through now. So that 18 months, even how conferences and talks have shifted and the energy that you need to bring to really engage people is different than how it was potentially before the pandemic. I mean, people always enjoyed storytelling in a framework, but it's even more so now because they could just watch you on Zoom otherwise, or giving a lecture. There is definitely much more of that performance element to it.
It reminds me of a presentation that I did at a marketing AI conference in July. And I talked about it on this podcast back last month. And that there was a part where I told a story about the first time that I was taken to Disney World by my mom with my little sister and how I ended up getting kind of lost, but just went on all the rides by myself for 3 hours and just like let my mom and my sister worry about me. And but I was totally fine because I was having a grand time. So I told that whole story as an example of great storytelling and how to what different elements to include. And I also acted it out as I almost like I didn't plan to act it out. I almost couldn't help it because I'm like getting into the line to go on the teacups and then I'm going over here and then looking for my mom, right?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I really give a lot of credit to you and going to the in-person event. It helped me practice in a safe space to like do that because like that I'm not. I'm very like I gesticulate and I'm a very physical person, but I've never felt comfortable with sort of quote unquote acting. Always very comfortable on the stage, talking, but it's doing that, and I've seen my growth as well. One of we're going to dive into a lot of the different specific examples, but one of the most rewarding things is after this conference that I was at in Brazil, some of the people who had seen me actually last fall, so 9 months earlier in Colombia, they're like, "Oh my gosh, you even upped your game on that much on this different level." And I can tell you more of what some of the things I've done, but I've gotten more comfortable with it, and I see the impact. And it's more
Oh,
fun because I'm not worried about it as much. I can just draw into that. And then it's become part of my repertoire. And it's just increasing my confidence and then the impact for the audience as well.
well, let's talk about that speaking engagement in Brazil that you had at the Lean Summit. And obviously you're big into the lean space because of the book and the work that you do. And then I remember we did a coaching session a couple of weeks before you were set to fly down to Brazil because all of a sudden they sprung something on you that you had not expected. Can you tell us about
Yeah.
that?
Well, our coaching session, I think, was literally the week before I was going out, Carol, because it was, well, it's a good reminder we should never make assumptions on format or anything going on and especially when with different languages, right? So to back up a bit, my book is called Learning to Lead, Leading to Learn, and it's about a Toyota leader named Asao Yoshino, who I met when I lived in Japan. And I work with continuous improvement practitioners and change leaders all across the world to really create these learning cultures in their organizations. And Toyota is one of the most renowned and well-known continuous improvement learning cultures. And I published my book in 2020. And since then, my book's been translated by many institutes and publishing companies into, I guess we're almost on 8 or 9 languages now. And so I've been invited to all these countries to speak on their main stages, about the book and my topics as well. So the most recent one was in Brazil, and they put on a huge conference. There were over 1,500 people. I was both the opening keynote for 25 minutes, and then I was asked to, which I felt very confident on because I've been doing that on different stages. So even though it was a bigger audience, I felt very comfortable in my delivery of that. Then the other two talks, which is where I could call a friend really quickly to Carol. We were going to talk about something else. Is I was to do two separate breakout sessions, which I assumed were like other breakout sessions I've done, which would be in a separate room with a smaller audience that was dedicated to just my session. And I discovered only through happenstance because I asked for a handout to be provided to the audience. And they said, "This is going to be hard." And I was like, "I don't understand." And they said, "Well, we're all going to be in the same room and you're going to be on the stage with 4 other people. We're breaking the 1,500 person main stage, which was actually, it was massive. I mean, it was a huge stage into 4 parts and people are going to be wearing headphones." And I was like, "Well, what do you mean? Like we're wearing headphones?" I knew there was some people be wearing headphones for me because they are doing simultaneous translation and interpretation, which I'm familiar with from being in Poland and Colombia and other places. They don't know the speakers your voice is not going to be amplified. They'll just go into the speaker and people can choose which channel they want to listen to. So people are sitting in the audience and they literally get to choose which of the 4 speakers. They said, well, generally people sit in front of the person they're listening to. So you'll probably still have like 400 people, tuning in because it's a huge event. But you won't know who's there. And you can't ask that, usually I see a breakout session being much more, a little bit hybrid of a talk plus maybe a little workshop-y. So there can be some interaction. Maybe people turn to each other. And so none of that. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to totally reimagine this. And I'm on a big stage still. So Yes, that's what I called you. It was really like a silent disco. I don't know if you've ever been to one of these where people like are listening to different things and they have their headphone on. And it was really eerie because I walked in to see this before my session in a room of 1,500 people, completely silent. And you can hear tiny little voices on the stage of the speakers. But yeah, but it actually worked out great. And so let's tell the story of what happened. So I called you knowing that I still needed to have an engaging um, experience. This was an hour-long talk with 15 minutes of Q&A, and me just up on the stage speaking for an hour. And I had two of these separate sessions, so two different talks. And I did have frameworks to use and pull from, but it was so I also wouldn't know who was in the audience listening to me. So this was another challenge. And I wanted them to walk away feeling inspired and engaged, and that it was, they had a great experience. But I wasn't going to be able to do it in the way that I knew. And one of the most, I guess, disconcerting things for me as a speaker is I get a lot of energy from seeing the audience and getting some interaction. Even if you're on the stage as a keynote speaker, being able to read people's expressions. And to know who's actually listening. So I was a little worried about that as well. But I decided this was an opportunity to lean into everything that I have been working on and challenge myself to even go further. And so I decided to just go for it. And, uh, I was using props. I used storytelling. I used the stage with acting even more. Like I was really just like, I remember I was like running across the stage and like, I was just like, I had to amplify everything. And also I wanted to figure out who was with me. And a good friend of mine, she's like, you have to use the physicality of the room because we could use Slido to like do some polls, which is helpful. And I do use that at the end. I didn't know who was listening to me. So I had this epiphany using this two thumbs up, which is when I go to Japan, one of the companies I go to talks about how to get your enthusiasm and your engagement from your team. And so they do these startup meetings of the day, and ine in Japanese is sort of the symbol for awesome. And so I was like, I'm just going to tell this whole story about being in Japan. And I had pictures of me with big groups of like two thumbs up. And so I asked everyone in the audience to say, one of the things about visualization is really important in this world of continuous improvement and lean. And so let's use some visualization. And I told a story about the two thumbs up. And I asked everyone to put their two thumbs up. And I could see there were hundreds of people watching me. And then everyone else in this silent room was able to see, oh, there's a lot of engagement going on here. So we were able to use the physicality of the room as well. So that was one way I used audience engagement to really not only help me as a speaker, but also to create that community of who was in there. And then not just using the Slido polls, I used that same element of physicality where I'd ask questions to the audience and ask them to put their hands up. And so then we still got the feedback. They could see who was engaged, and I already had sort of a baseline of who was with me, so we could work from there. So that was kicking that off. Is that first audience engagement was so critical, both for the audience but also for me, and it also freed up my mind. Oh, there's another story to have in here, and I had a video that I was able to share later of me actually in Japan doing this ine two thumbs up. So I was able to think of things that I hadn't previously thought of for a talk.
Katie, a couple of things that pop out to me. First, I love that you were excited about the challenge of doing something that you had never done before that seems very nerve-wracking. Think about you're on this huge stage with three other speakers. You have no idea in the audience who is listening to you. They all have headphones on. Everyone is silenced. Like you said, you don't get the same energy and feedback as you would from a regular talk that you would be doing. So, but I love that you embraced the challenge of doing that and found ways to make it work for you and for the audience. And then the other thing is that you talked about having to amplify your presence on the stage and go even bigger. And it reminds me that I went to New York City in August for my birthday with my mom, whose birthday is also in August. And so we do love to do this trip together. And we went to see a musical on Broadway, which we always love to do. And the same thing with these Broadway performers. I mean, it's a much smaller venue than what you were in, but they have to be larger than life. They have to amplify everything that they're doing, the expressions on their face, they're acting, they're singing, they're dancing, because they're on a stage performing for the audience. They can't give 90%. They can't even give 100%. They have to give that 120%.
Yes, absolutely. And so it it was almost liberating though to say, you know what, this is a brand experiment for me. And I actually started my talk saying this, saying like, I found out about this format. Like, I have no idea how this is going to go, but I'm here to still deliver on, you know, you having an engaging experience, learning something, feeling inspired. And so those are the principles that are guiding me, and let's go for it. And so it was a kind of a nice segue to get into it. And then speaking of other audience engagement, I used this Daruma doll. So you can see, I'm obsessed with these Japanese figures that represent the proverb, fall down 7 times, get up 8. So knowing that we're going to have setbacks and challenges along the way, they're rated at the bottom so they come back up. And I remembered that in Japan, I actually had a Daruma I hadn't used yet. That this says Ine, I'm showing you right now. On my blue Daruma, it says in Japanese, this says Ine with the Daruma doll showing a thumbs up. So I brought it as another prop that connected to my story. And so it was just another element that I was able to use. And then I decided, you know what? I always give Daruma dolls, these mini ones, away as gifts. And instead of giving them my workshop, I decided to throw them into the audience at the end of my talk. I'm a terrible thrower. It was a little embarrassing, but that also created engagement and enthusiasm in a different way. So still into this audience where 1,500 people are sitting, but I know most people are sort of in the section in front of me. I was just throwing dolls out and like making it fun, right? And
Yes.
people said I was the best speaker they'd heard at the conference. They loved it, both talks. And I still continue to get messages on LinkedIn for people saying how inspired they were by me and not the energy and also the messages. But if I'd had a talk there where I was not being engaging, the messages wouldn't have landed. And so both the message was important and the delivery was so critical as well.
Yes, I love the use of the props. And for those of you listening, you can actually see the video of our conversation right now where Katie showed the Daruma doll on the show notes page for this episode. So just click on in your podcast app, go to the show notes page, and you can see the video of our conversation. And speaking of props, so at that presentation that I did at Macon, I also had a prop where I had these paddles. One side was a smiley face representing a human, the other side was a robot representing AI. So at different parts of the presentation, I would ask the people in the audience to raise their paddle, whether they think the robot or the human either wrote this or who would be better at such and such. And it was just a fun way to have something literally tactical and
Yes.
tangible to have them have that audience engagement.
And absolutely. So that's great for a somewhat smaller audience where you're able to
Yes.
set that up in advance. And I encourage people to think about how could they use show of hands or, other physicality from the audience, especially when you're doing more of a keynote or what seems to be a one-way engagement where you're not able to have people turn next to each other and have conversation as well.
Yes. All right, Katie. I'm so glad that you had that experience in Brazil and that you were able to come and share that with us. Let's talk about some other audience engagement techniques for smaller venues or even conference sessions where maybe you only have 50 to 100 people, so you can have a little bit more interaction. You mentioned show of hands, which is great. One thing that I keep my attention to is what the time of day I'm speaking at a conference and what participants have done right before my session.
Right.
So for example, if I know it's towards the end of the day or right after lunch and people naturally are getting a little bit more tired, they're a little more sluggish, I will sometimes ask questions where instead of show of hands, I'll have people stand up. So, if your podcast is in this genre, when I spoke at a podcasting conference, stand up. If it's in this one, I don't really care so much about the question. I mean, I do, but I don't. I just literally want them moving their bodies for a few minutes.
Yes, absolutely. So that getting people to stand up is great as well. The hands, the arms up. Any physicality from the audience is different than what they're used to.
Yeah.
uh, we can go on to the smaller audience too. This one also fits for a larger or smaller audience. And I did find using something like a Slido presentation or the short poll worked for doing like a one word, like what's the one word you have taking away, or asking a poll here at the end to get some engagement. So it wasn't like it totally open, but then it went up onto the main screen. So people saw the engagement and the reaction others were having either in a word cloud or ranking the things that I was then, because I wasn't able to ask the audience directly always. And so I interspersed the show of hands with the poll online. And so that was another way to also mix up the format that you're using for engagement. And so that could work for a small conference or for a large one as well.
That's a great idea, Katie. And also it could work whether in person or virtual
Oh, yes,
presentations.
absolutely. I was actually leveraged in a lot of what I have learned from doing so many virtual presentations, and not just, training, but like keynotes. I've done a lot of those keynotes where really like I'm looking at my slides and having to project energy to nothing. And so I was like, I've gotten really good at just how do you project that energy and engage people, even if you can't get the feedback directly from them with eye contact. So how do you use those things as well?
Yeah. And let's think so some more audience engagement techniques that I know that have been useful to me both virtually and in person is obviously you can ask questions of the audience again depending on size. If it's like the 50 to 75 or even 100 people, you can ask them to answer out loud.
Yeah.
The thing that is key, and I see a lot of speakers run into this problem, is that they ask questions that are way too complicated
No.
for the audience to be able to answer quickly and succinctly. So make sure if you are wanting them to, first of all, let them know you want them to shout out loud or you want them to respond out loud, just like popcorn style. They don't have to wait for a mic or what have you. And then make the questions easy enough for them to figure out an answer really quickly.
Absolutely. So the way I do that in a virtual setting is use the chat function. And it doesn't matter. I mean, I've done this with a few hundred people, and just you see the words coming through. And then as a facilitator, you can scroll in through and just starting to say some of the words. So it's still, and people are able to see that as well. So that's a really nice way to get that engagement interaction for people as well.
And the one thing also to do is to put the question on the slide that you're asking the audience, whether you're in person or virtual, because sometimes you'll ask a question and the audience, they were looking at their phone or they just like zoned out for a minute. And then like, oh, wait, she asked a question. What did she ask? And then they feel lost. So always put the question on the slide.
Absolutely. So I try and intersperse having very simple dynamic visuals behind me and then use those questions or like a few words to anchor and intersperse as well. Also to mix up the format for people as well.
Yeah. All right, Katie, anything else come to mind as far as audience engagement techniques anything that you've tried that you're like, that didn't go as well as I had anticipated?
Yeah. I've also been doing some hybrid events as well. Like I did this one recently there were probably 800 people participating. Is in a mix of multi in-person sites. This is for a private client for one of their leadership retreats and virtual. And so we were trying to figure out, we did it twice in the same day. So we had a chance to learn from what worked and what didn't. I think what was hard is we wanted reflection to come in from all the groups. And that was a really hard thing to do, but we had enough people there that we were able to I just used the reflection from the people who were in the virtual format. So, it's challenging to be doing different hybrid things. So I was remote with about a few hundred people remote and then several hundred people in person. And so how do we still have that engagement and feedback that can happen? It's just something we have to be continuing to experiment with. When they had on ground facilitators, they were able to have that discussion themselves, but we weren't able to do it as effectively in that environment. But I also think it still had a good impact, and so that ultimately doesn't totally matter. But I think my brain's thinking about how can I make that better for next time in a similar format.
One thing that has definitely come out of the pandemic is that there are so many different ways to set up events and speaking engagements nowadays. Before the pandemic, it literally was you just showed up and you were in person and the whole audience was in person, or you happened to do a webinar that was online. That was basically the two options. Now there are so many different configurations. And so as the speaker, make sure you're having conversations with the event organizers that you understand exactly what the tech is, the setup is, in-person, virtual, hybrid, so that you feel confident going into it.
Right, absolutely. And clarifying too, so for a virtual session, are you giving a keynote or are you doing a webinar format? Because you show up in a little bit different way and structure things differently as well. So getting clarity on what the client is expecting should be very helpful.
Yes, and on double check with them like a week or two beforehand, as well as whatever conversations you had much earlier.
Well, then clarify if a breakout session is indeed a breakout in a separate room session, or that you will be in a silent disco format with multiple people on the stage. I do want to say that I was really worried about, was I going to hear other people? And it actually was fine as the speaker. I just spoke to the first few rows of the audience because they could hear me like a normal speaking voice. And so that's what I really focused on, and then being bigger than life and projecting out. But it wasn't as awkward as I thought it was going to be.
Right, you weren't having to scream because obviously you have a mic, so you're being mic'd and they're listening to you
Yeah.
through the
I was
headphones.
like, all right, I'm just
Right.
doing like a workshop of 30 people. Another audience engagement thing, which I experimented with, was bringing my iPhone on the stage and then taking a selfie with people behind it. Cause I had this huge audience. So I had them all doing this thumbs up thing. So then I turned around and, everyone was really excited and happy to put that up. And so I don't know, that's can be another fun thing, depending on the format. That was sort of a spontaneous thing that emerged, but people were so excited. I was like, oh, let's take a picture.
You have great photos from that Brazil event, and I'm gonna link to your LinkedIn post in the show notes for the photos that I think one of the photos is the
Yes,
selfie
it
that you
was.
did. So the listeners can go check that one out and make sure to, of course, to connect with Katie on LinkedIn when you're there. Katie, you mentioned earlier that you had attended our in-person client retreat. We did that, the first one in April 2022. We did our second one earlier this year, February 2023. We're doing our next one now, it's third annual, in February 2024 in Orlando, Florida. It is 3 days. The first 2 days are practice on our stage, and then the third day is professional filming so that participants leave with video clips that they can use, and obviously all of the practice and feedback from us literally on the stage, so that to work on storytelling, props, the audience engagement, using the stage, the vocal variation, all of that. Katie, you mentioned that how helpful it was to you, especially going into a lot of these in-person speaking engagements. What else do you have to say about that
Well,
experience?
absolutely. So from a practice and really was the beginning of me getting more comfortable and you challenging me to like do more of the acting and try things out. So that was really tremendously helpful, in addition to all of our virtual coaching as well. And also just the cohort of women who were there. Like I've made lifelong friends. I'm working with one of them actually as my business and branding coach that I've been working with for a year. And like, so professional connections, personal connections, just really amazing people that come together with you, Carol. So, and the support that we all gave each other to up level our speaking and was so helpful. So the practice and the being in person and getting back on the stage and trying something different. So you're not trying it totally on in front of an audience was a real reassuring thing for me. Uh, and then I was able to build on that. And now 18 months later, I always have there's more room for improvement than I was so thrilled at being in front of 1,500 people and then doing all these other events and really feeling like I really solid and not nervous. I wasn't nervous at all. It was great.
Well, I feel like, Katie, I know you're a stellar scholar from our speaker archetype quiz, and I know so many of our clients are and listeners are, and I tend to be that as well. And we live so much of our lives in our heads. We're smart, we're high achieving, we're intellectuals. We think about content a lot. We think about our frameworks and the messages that we want to share with our audience. And I feel like having the practice literally in person on the stage gets us more in our bodies, but then
Yeah.
also helps to cement our content in
Yeah.
our bodies in a way that's different than just thinking about it in our heads.
Absolutely. So, I was saying it was uncomfortable for me to act out some of these things that we actually created while I was there at the in-person retreat. So, some of the lion I mentioned and actually, like physically do this and then like map out things and like, oh, this feels really unnatural to me. But doing that and then doing it a few times on stage when it didn't feel as comfortable for me. So I really had to be thinking about it more. Then I'm able to pull those elements into different talks at different times now and just release into it. And I can actually be bigger now, in the acting it out because I'm not thinking about it so much. So that practice really creates that muscle memory. And then you can up level your speaking as well because you're just in the moment and not having to think about it so much. So I highly recommend Carol, the Speaking Your Brand in-person retreat. It was not only great fun and great women, but it also just great practice. It really up leveled my speaking and I'm getting such positive feedback from it now.
Oh, well,
Well,
thank you so much, Katie. And for those of you listening, as of right now, registration is open for February at speakingyourbrand.com/retreat. Again, that's speakingyourbrand.com/retreat. All the information is on there. the dates, the location, the pricing, what we're going to do over these 3 days, testimonials from women who've attended, like Katie. It really is an incredible group of women. And I feel like I know so many of our clients from Zoom because we do spend a lot of time literally on screens face to face, but there is something that's special about having that time in person together.
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
it was great.
All right, Katie, where can listeners best connect with you? And you have a new channel
Yeah.
that you are diving into as
Thank
well.
you. Yes, I'm a high achiever and always putting something new goals in front of myself. So first, my name is Katie Anderson. You can reach me on my website, which is KBJ with an ON.com. Also, that's my handle on LinkedIn. So Katie Anderson on LinkedIn is the best social media platform to connect with me there. And I have a podcast as well. It was sort of a soft launch. But I'm working right now to actively up-level the podcast and make it even bigger. Right now, it's been author interviews that I've been doing for the last few years and making audio tracks of that. And now I'm going even bigger. So it's called Leading to Learn, which is part of my book's title. So go to Leading to Learn on your favorite podcast channels and check out the content that's there, and know that more and better content is even coming more this year as I continue to up-level. So thank you.
Fantastic, Katie. Well, thank you so much for coming back on the Speaking Your Brand podcast and for sharing your in-person speaking experience. Here's to many more fun and challenging ones in the future.
Thank you. I'll be phoning Carol to help plan the next ones that come up. Thank you so much.